The NBA playoffs, where stars are either made or where stars can either fade. Most NBA fans, we recognize this is the most important time of the year because not only does it shape and carve a player's legacy, but it also plays a crucial role in how a franchise will decide to move for its future based on the expectations they had for this point in the postseason. In fact, in this playoffs alone, we've already witnessed 4 championship contending level coaches fired from their position as a result of failing to meet expectations for this year's postseason. And that is alongside the fact that in the past 5 years, each of these coaches at some point in their career were considered and awarded for being the best coaches in the NBA. With that being said, with so many teams going into this playoffs believing they had a chance to win it all, it is going to be interesting how franchises make their offseason decisions based off of the new CBA deal and how players performed in this year's playoffs. Especially since so many teams and franchises went into this year's postseason believing that whether it was a trade or a free agent signing, that they were confident that they had found the missing piece that would take them to the next level. And for some teams, that was the case. For the Knicks, though there is many questions surrounding Julius Randle's future on this team, one thing that deserves no questioning is how much of an offensive catalyst that Jalen Brunson has been for them in this year's playoffs, and how well he's surpassed expectations following the contract that was given to him from the Knicks in the previous offseason. Outplaying Donovan Mitchell yet again in another first-round matchup, and leading the charge for the Knicks to win their first playoff series since 2013. And that is alongside his co-star in Julius Randle, who really managed to outdo himself this time, with yet again another disappointing playoff run, averaging just over 3 turnovers a game while having a true shooting percentage of 43% and only having 2 games in this entire playoffs where he managed to shoot over 50% from the field. Fortunately for Knicks fans, Tom Thibodeau was able to coach this team into looking like one of the best defensive teams of their entire playoffs and received huge contributions from their role players in Mitchell Robinson, who was a huge factor in their first round series against Cleveland for his rim protection and how much he crashed the offensive glass against their front court. Having versatility on the defensive end, specifically on the perimeter, with even having switchable defenders such as Josh Hart, Quentin Grimes, and even Emmanuel Quickley before his injury in round 2. Not only would the Knicks win the series in just 5 games, but they also beat a team that had the #1 defense in the regular season, had home court advantage, and were favorites to be dark horse contenders coming out of the East. Even though they would lose to Miami in the next series in just 6 games, at least the city can sleep peacefully at night, knowing that the Knicks had just concluded their best playoff run in over the past decade. For the Lakers, on the other hand, to begin the season with a 2-10 start and to drop as low in the Western Conference standings to as low as a 13th seed, months later finding themselves competing against the Denver Nuggets in the conference finals, following a series of trades around trade deadline that replaced almost half of their rotation, and for a roster with less than half of a season of chemistry under their belts, was still competent enough to beat some of the biggest frontrunners we've seen in recent history in the 2nd-seeded Memphis Grizzlies in just 6 games, with Game 6 being a 40-point blowout, handing the organizations one of their biggest blowout losses in their franchise's playoff history.
Nah, I'm fine in the West.
This matchup being the first series to display the Lakers' newly added depth as a result of the trades they made earlier on in the regular season. And for the first time in his career, a playoff run where LeBron seemingly looked like he was in cruise control. While Father Time might take part of the responsibility for that, I'd even go as far as to say that this roster that LeBron had in this year's playoffs was the deepest team that he's ever been part of in his career. 5 Lakers averaging nearly over 15 points in just this series alone, and LeBron having the lowest usage rate in this year's playoffs as opposed to the rest of his postseason runs. There wasn't a game in this series where it was extremely necessary for him to score over 30 points, yet this roster managed to get it done on both ends of the floor, and even more specifically on offense, as he was able to reliably share the ball handling duties with other guards on the team such as D'Lo, Schroeder, and Austin Reeves, who was a huge X factor in this team's offense. Yet the man still managed to accomplish milestones, whereas in Game 4 of this series, he would go for an all-time performance where he would score 23 points and pull down 20 rebounds, becoming the first Lakers since Shaq in 04 to record a 20-20 game in the playoffs, and individually having a career-high night on the boards. Not to mention that within this same Game 4, that late in the 4th, LeBron would score an unreal tough and one layup to put the game away and to secure the 3-1 lead on Memphis, and would release a roar so loud that hopefully it would remind Dillon Brooks to never poke the bear again.
I don't respect no one until they come and give me 40.
Ironically, for as much as AD is ridiculed for his injury history, he definitely proved through the entirety of this Lakers playoff run that he has looked more like the defensive player of the year than the reigning defensive player of the year. Averaging double the amount of blocks that Jaren Jackson Jr. managed to average and having the highest plus-minus in the entire playoffs. And then to follow up that series with beating the previous reigning champs in the Golden State Warriors in just another 6 games in the second round. This time having 6 Lakers averaging double figures, and Lonnie Walker coming into the series replacing Rui Hachimura as the unexpected unsung hero of the team. Despite getting their asses swept by Denver, that there is no doubt that they were able to turn around what was once a very terrible start to the season into a very unexpected and impressive ending. But unfortunately will ultimately only be judged through the lens of the short championship window left in LeBron's career. Now, to discuss teams on the other side of the fence that didn't quite meet their standards or surpass them despite the adjustments the organizations had made, it is going to be a very long summer filled with some tough decisions over these next 2 off seasons, because I can almost guarantee that as a result of this postseason that there will be a frequent amount of pieces being moved in order to get closer to success in the playoffs. Firstly, let's begin with the previous champions in the Golden State Warriors. And after this postseason, the biggest question on everyone's mind when it comes to this team is whether the dynasty is truly over. Is the nucleus of Curry, Draymond, and Klay still conducive for competing for championship rings, and can they still dominate the modern NBA? While it might be a bit hyperbolic to use the word dominate since these guys are getting up there in age, and witnessing how they struggled in rounds 1 and 2 of this year's playoffs with an almost identical roster that they won a championship with, in short, yes. I do believe that that very same nucleus is able to give teams out west a run for their money for at least the next 3 to 4 years, because I don't believe that there are many trios in NBA history, let alone in today's NBA, that can come even close to the level of chemistry that these guys share on the court together, that can produce winning at the highest stage. Even though realistically it would require Klay or Draymond to take a significant financial sacrifice contract-wise for the organization to gather players that complement them as well as they complement each other, which Draymond was willing to do in hopes of getting Kevin Durant on the team the following summer after their first title run back in 2015. But with him and Klay Thompson entering the later years of their career, it is a lot less of a guarantee for them to be so willing to accept such a sacrifice, especially when their skill set can impact winning for almost any roster in the NBA, despite both of them not being at their peaks defensively. But if you're a Warriors fan hoping for this crew to stay together, then you have no other choice than to be optimistic of the reports that Klay Thompson might be the most likely recipient of that pay cut. But it does generate the question on whether the organization should just stick to what they know with that nucleus, or whether they should take on a risk in trying out a new formula and experiencing a new core. It definitely leads to the curiosity of what is the future for Golden State, and whether Jordan Poole's contract that was given to him in last year's offseason is still worthy of him being a good fit in this piece of the puzzle. While Poole's era in Golden State may or may not be coming closer to an end, that there is still a handful of franchises that will take a combo guard that is exceptional at creating a shot for himself and is capable of averaging 20 points a game. Of course, there is parts of Poole's game that do need more discipline. He is a net negative defender, as in both series in this playoffs, both LeBron and Fox were heavy on trying to get him switched on to them as a mismatch hunt. On the playmaking department, while Poole is solid at making basic reads and being the lead ball handler in a pick and roll situation, Poole's assist to turnover ratio has never been great in his career, and he does tend to make some head scratching decisions both on the offensive and defensive end. But at the end of the day, the dude is only 23. For him having to carry the heavy expectation of being this complete all-around player as a second option on a championship team this early in his career still is pretty heavy to put on the man, even if he did receive a contract extension that was a heavy bet on doing so. Not only just finishing his 4th season in the NBA, but his 2nd season of even making the playoffs is almost unrealistic, especially when you considered when the man was drafted in his draft class. That being said, I think OG Anunoby would be a perfect replacement for the man if that trade was to happen. I heard it had some traction around last year's trade deadline. Not only does he fit the timeline of this team with more room to improve, but he would undoubtedly provide a bigger boost on the defensive end while also contributing some championship experience as well. And in whatever Golden State decides to do in the offseason, I would heavily advise for them to keep Kevon Looney, because his transformation this playoffs from going from an above average rebounder to one of the best rebounders in the league, at least for me personally, that was one of the most unexpected character development plot twists that I could have seen in this year's playoff arc, especially when you consider that the man was matched up with the league's best rebounders from last season in both series. Just from an IQ perspective, his understanding of the game and how underrated his playmaking is within that Golden State system and how well he knows it, he just makes a perfect fit for the front court of that team. With all of that being said, it is still necessary for the Warriors to add some size to their front court, and I do believe that some potential options they can explore for some big men in this year's free agency could be options such as Mason Plumlee or even Jock Landale from Phoenix. Whether it's coming off the bench or starting in a series or a specific matchup where the Warriors may need more size, either option will be serviceable to their rotations and will be able to provide effort plays on either end of the floor. In my opinion, I do believe that this roster has the best depth in the NBA. And yes, I'm a Westbrook fan, all right? I do like his fit within this team. And if you run it back with this same roster, they'd still be a top-tier Western Conference team that most NBA teams would still have to be weary of come playoff time. While it was very relieving to see Westbrook step in the hot tub of youth for a playoff series after having a horrendous, nightmarish start to the NBA season on the Lakers, puts us in a position where we can only imagine what his impact would have had on the result of this series if only the best players of this team were healthy enough to contribute. But of course, with this franchise's luck, it just so happens that this duo consists of two of the most unreliable stars to lead a franchise, potentially in NBA history, coinciding with the fact that both of them are the faces of load management during the regular season. With a roster that has several switchable defenders and many valuable role players that would qualify for starting spots on other teams. With one of the best coaches in the NBA, should they run it back with this talent? Should they give it another gamble with Kawhi and Paul George going into the last guaranteed year of their contract and risk letting both of them walk in free agency for potentially nothing if the team fails to meet expectations of a championship in next year's postseason? And this ultimatum, I would have to answer a whopping hell no. I can understand the organization not rushing to hit the restart button with this team because, for one, as injury prone as he is, generational talent such as Kawhi Leonard doesn't come by so often in this league. And two, they did dig themselves in quite a bit of a deep hole for their future, given their draft capital since the Paul George trade. And I know we live in an instant gratification type of society where we would prefer results sooner than later, being that in the grand scheme of things, 4 years really isn't that long when you think about it. Or is it? Let's just briefly acknowledge what this duo has managed to accomplish since they're pairing with one another. In 2020, they would fire Doc Rivers following a playoff collapse in the second round of the Western Conference postseason when they would go on to choke a 3-1 lead to the Denver Nuggets. With both Kawhi and Paul George playing terrible in the elimination game, combining for 24 points and each shooting below 30% from the field. In the following season, which is perhaps the best season that this organization can point to with this duo, the Clippers would make it as far as their first conference finals in franchise history, led by Paul George arguably having the best playoffs of his career, when Kawhi would get injured in Game 4 of a Round 2 series against Utah, which would cause him to miss the remainder of the 2022 season, alongside Paul George suffering an elbow injury within the same season that would force him to be sidelined for half the year, and he would rush back to resurrect the Clippers' playoff hopes, only to eventually rush back and face off against the Minnesota Timberwolves in the play-in tournament, and as a result would miss the entire playoffs, getting defeated by both teams. Now we fast forward to this year's postseason and just take a wild guess in how the Clippers decided to bounce back following a very disappointing ending to their last season. Nah, like for real, take a guess. I'll wait. Paul George gets hurt right before the playoffs, and after looking amazing in his return back to the playoffs in his first 2 games, Kawhi tears his meniscus in Game 2, resulting in him missing the rest of the series. For those of you that haven't noticed the reoccurring theme, let me just put it this simply. If the 2023 playoffs haven't taught you anything thus far, it's that no matter how talented a team might seem on paper, if your stars don't show up when the roster needs it most, then that roster will not make it far. And maybe that statement is obvious to the average NBA fan, but in this year's playoffs, it seems like the value of that statement has led to more unpredictable results than we could have expected out of a postseason. In a playoffs where the best player of a team was featured in trade rumors mid-series, observing the league's reigning MVP and back-to-back scoring champions suffer the biggest points per game decline from the regular season to the playoffs.
Someone said it was not a failure, steps to success. But yeah, you just gotta, it's tough.
Where we witnessed two of the best Game 7 performances we've seen in NBA history, a 7-foot center leading his team in nearly every stat and casually averaging a triple-double the entirety of the playoffs, a first round where 3 of the 8 matchups featured a top 3 seed being eliminated by the lower seeded team, a conference finals that featured 2 teams that came so close to missing the playoffs entirely and made it via the play-in tournament and entering the postseason as the 7th and 8th seed, to recreating a conference finals we previously witnessed back in 2020. And an NBA Finals being hosted by not only one of the most underrated #1 seeds we've seen in recent history, facing off against an 8 seed that managed to beat teams that we labeled as contenders for majority of the season in the Milwaukee Bucks and Boston Celtics, making history, becoming only the 2nd 8 seed to ever make the NBA Finals in over 20 years, while having more undrafted players on their roster than any other team in the NBA, in making a legitimate case for being the best AC we've ever seen compete in the NBA playoffs. But for as much respect that Miami deserves, even making it to this point in the postseason without arguably their 3rd best player, and making their 2nd run to the finals in just 4 seasons. I know it's fresh off the finals loss, but I'ma just go out and say it. Miami should do everything in their power this offseason to win the Damian Lillard sweepstakes if he is traded from Portland this offseason. And with all due respect for Jimmy Butler to leading his team to this point, but after the decline in production after that first round series, it is very clear that he is no Hakeem Olajuwon or no Dirk Nowitzki. For as great as Miami's defense looked throughout this postseason, and as well as they shot the 3-ball as a collective, there was just moments where Miami's offense would just become stagnant if Jimmy Butler wasn't forcing his way to the free throw line or creating for others. Though his teammates deserve almost as much credit for stepping up in their roles tremendously unexpectedly. Max Strus, for example, despite having a pretty shitty finals, was still reliable in taking on the ball handling responsibilities and creating a nice 2-man game with Bam in the pick and roll setting. Then you have Caleb Martin, who seemed just more comfortable at taking shots more off the dribble. Gabe Vincent, who was way more comfortable in playing in screen actions and just effective from the 3-point line, but again was also shitty in the finals as well. And you also have Duncan Robinson, who came alive in this postseason and creating more of a reputation for himself, moving off the ball on backdoor cuts and even creating plays for himself and others, cutting to the basket and being more than just a shooter. But it was clear that after round 1 that Miami had just lacked a consistent #1 option, with Jimmy struggling to really find that balance between when to be passive and when to be an aggressive scorer. That being said, to address the other contenders that fell short of their goals, let's just briefly touch on them for a quick second before closing this video out. When it comes to Philly, while it is a bit concerning to see Joel Embiid to go from crying 5 years ago for not making it past the 2nd round to seemingly laughing about Philly's playoff success this season, is, y'all do what y'all do with that information. But if there's anything that this year's playoffs has managed to prove to us, is that with Jokic winning his first championship, is that not only does it shoot down the comparisons between Embiid and Jokic, but even the difference in leadership being put at full display if you see the comparison in how Embiid handles his losses compared to Jokic. Jokic's stoic personality and his overall willingness to make his teammates better has not only led to more of a winning culture within Denver, but it is also nearly impossible to find a clip of this man bragging about his personal impact on the team or even talking down on past teammates. Whereas Embiid, nearly after every playoff loss, I wouldn't go as far as to say he always dodges accountability, but he does passively throw slick remarks and criticisms about teammates in the past. I personally believe that if Philly doesn't decide to blow it all up this season, that they should prioritize Tyrese Maxey as the second option on this team. And I also believe that with a coach like Nick Nurse, that he would be able to bring the best out of this team defensively. As for Harden's future on this team, while some people might give him a pass for having 2 good games in that Boston series, I just personally wouldn't give a man $40 million for 2 or 3 good games in the playoffs, especially when throughout the course of his 13-year career, he's never really had the greatest reputation in that atmosphere, and I don't see that improving with age. For the 2 contenders out east that have semi-hit a wall in their trip back to the finals, well, they will also be met with some difficult decisions for vital players on their roster. For Milwaukee, while they can lead on the excuse that Giannis just wasn't able to hit free throws and he did only play 2.5 games in that first round series, their offense still seems to be stagnant in off-ball situations and against certain defensive schemes. And for Boston, while their team is as talented as any in the league, their offense definitely becomes over-reliant on threes when they are playing from behind, and they become a little too ISO heavy amongst their stars when their team struggles to generate offense. But I am a firm believer that both of these teams will figure it out with some simple retooling. And speaking of retooling, it does seem like Phoenix has gotten a head start on that in this year's offseason as opposed to other teams, but more on that in a video coming soon. So to keep this video short, with that being said, if you guys ended up enjoying the video, leave a like down below and subscribe to the channel if you're new. You know we get litty in this section, and it's been Sorbo Hoops talking about some hoops. Shout out to the Sacramento Kings, even though I barely spoke on them throughout the course of this video, but they definitely deserve some acknowledgement for taking the previous reigning champs to 7 games after ending their 17-year-long playoff drought. And shout out to Denver and winning their first championship in franchise history. Be easy, y'all.